She was standing in his living room wearing nothing but his blue shirt, barefoot, vulnerable, and impossible to ignore. Gabriel froze on the stairs, his breath catching as he saw her there. It wasn't just the fabric falling against her skin or the morning light casting shadows across her collarbone. It was the look in her eyes, half shame, half confidence, that made his heart stop. How did they get here? And what would that morning change between them forever? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the super thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. The cold air that morning in Maplewood carried the smell of pine and wet earth, remnants of the rain that had fallen during the night. Inside Gabriel's house, warmth enveloped every corner, the kind of warmth that came from aged wood and years of quiet solitude. Soft rays of sunlight filtered through the linen curtains, drawing golden patterns on the wooden floor, playing with dust particles that floated lazily in the stillness. The house gave off a faint aroma of coffee he'd made earlier, mixed with the clean scent of washed cotton. Gabriel descended the stairs slowly, barefoot, his hand sliding along the wooden railing worn smooth by time. He expected silence. He expected the familiar rhythm of another solitary morning. What he didn't expect was her. Gigi stood in the living room, framed by the morning light like a painting he couldn't look away from. She wore only his blue shirt, the one he'd worn the day before that still carried his scent. The fabric hung loose on her smaller frame, the hem brushing mid-thigh, revealing long, bare legs that seemed almost luminous in the soft glow. The top buttons were undone just enough to show the delicate curve of her collarbone, the vulnerable hollow of her throat where her pulse visibly throbbed. She was barefoot, her toes curling slightly against the cold wooden floor, as if she were anchoring herself to something solid. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder, still tousled from sleep, and there was something painfully intimate about seeing her like this, unguarded with nowhere to hide, real. Gabriel's breath caught in his chest. His heart pounded against his ribs with a force that surprised him. She turned slowly, as if sensing his presence before seeing him. When their eyes met, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Those eyes, deep brown, flecked with amber in the morning light, held a mixture of shame and something else. Confidence. Raw, terrifying confidence. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, heavy with everything that hadn't been said, everything that was felt, but not yet acknowledged. Gabriel could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, the distant call of a dove outside, the whisper of fabric as Gigi shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, fragile as glass. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't find my clothes from last night. They were still wet, and I—" "Don't," Gabriel interrupted gently, descending one step, then another. His voice was rough with sleep and something deeper. "Don't apologize." He moved closer slowly, carefully as if approaching something wild and precious that might flee at any sudden movement. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his feet. With each step, the space between them shrank, and the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, with possibility, with the weight of what this moment meant. When he was close enough to see the fine details, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way her lips were slightly parted, the rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath his shirt, he stopped. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Close enough to catch her scent, a mixture of his soap from the shower she'd taken, and something uniquely hers, vanilla and rain. "You look—" He let the sentence die, searching for words that wouldn't shatter the fragile beauty of this moment. "You look like you belong here." A blush crept up her neck, coloring her cheeks the softest shade of pink. She looked down, thick lashes casting shadows on her cheekbones, but she didn't pull away, didn't hide. Instead, she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze again with something that looked like courage. "Do I?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in those two words that made Gabriel's chest ache. "Yes," he breathed. The sunlight shifted, bathing them both in warmth. Gabriel noticed details he'd been too careful not to notice before, the way the shirt's fabric draped over the curve of her hip, how it revealed just enough of her shoulder when she moved, how the blue made her skin seem to glow. He noticed the way she held herself, no longer as broken as the woman he'd found weeks ago at the dock, but not yet fully whole either. She was somewhere in between, suspended in the space between fear and freedom. His hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. His fingertips barely grazed her arm, the lightest touch, skin against skin, and he felt her shiver, not from cold, from something entirely different. "Gabriel," she whispered his name like a prayer, like a question, like an answer all at once. His thumb traced a small circle on her arm, and he watched her skin pebble in the wake of his touch. Her breathing quickened. So did his. They stood there in that charged space, connected by the smallest of touches, by the largest of feelings. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, needing her to know, needing her to believe it down to her bones. "I know," she replied, and her voice was steady despite the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "That's what scares me." Gabriel understood. He understood that sometimes safety felt more dangerous than survival, that healing required more bravery than enduring. He understood that she was terrified not of him, but of the way he made her feel, seen, valued, wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with taking and everything to do with giving. The moment stretched between them like blown glass, beautiful, delicate, impossible to hold without risking everything. Gabriel knew they were on the edge of something that would change them both. He could see it in her eyes, could feel it in the electric space between their bodies, could taste it in the air they shared. But he didn't kiss her. Not yet. Not when she still wore yesterday's fear along with his shirt, not when the morning was too young and she was too raw. Instead, he let his hand fall, even though every cell in his body screamed to pull her against him, to close the distance that ached between them. "I'll make breakfast," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You can stay as long as you need." Gigi nodded, biting her lower lip, and Gabriel had to turn away before his resolve shattered. As he walked toward the kitchen, he could feel her gaze burning into his back, could feel the weight of what hadn't happened hanging in the air like a promise. And as he measured out the coffee and listened to the water begin to boil, a single question echoed in his mind. How could something as simple as a woman wearing his shirt make his entire world rearrange itself? 3 weeks before that morning, Gabriel had woken to the sound of rain pounding violently against his windows. It was the kind of storm Maplewood rarely saw, furious, relentless, the kind that made people stay indoors and thank God for the roof over their heads. The wind howled through the pine trees, ripping off leaves and small branches, scattering them across the deserted streets like wet confetti. He should have stayed home, should have made his coffee, lit the fireplace, and spent the day reading or working on his woodworking projects in the basement. But something pulled him outside, a restlessness he couldn't name, a weight in his chest that demanded movement, action, anything other than standing still watching the rain fall. Gabriel grabbed his rain jacket, pulled the hood over his head, and walked out into the storm. The rain was freezing, piercing, soaking through his jeans in seconds, despite the protection up top. His boots splashed through puddles forming quickly on the uneven sidewalks. The smell of wet earth and ozone filled the air, mixed with the distant aroma of wood smoke coming from neighboring chimneys. He walked with no particular destination, letting his feet guide him through the familiar streets of Maplewood, past the old stone church with its steeple that needed repairs, past the grocery store where Mrs. Martinez always saved the reddest apples for him, past the park where children played on sunny days. Everything was empty now, abandoned to the storm's fury. His steps eventually led him to the river, to that old wooden dock that had survived decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. The boards creaked and groaned under the wind's pressure, and Gabriel could hear the water slamming furiously against the support pillars below. The river's surface was choppy, dark waves breaking against each other, white foam dancing on top. That's when he saw her. A huddled figure at the end of the dock, so small and still that he almost didn't notice her. His heart leapt into his throat. What the hell was someone doing out there alone in a storm like this? Gabriel ran, his feet pounding heavily against the wet wood, nearly slipping twice before reaching her. When he got close enough, his stomach twisted painfully. It was a woman, young, maybe in her early 30s, sitting on the cold-soaked dock floor, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs in a self-comforting embrace that offered no comfort at all. Her light jacket was completely drenched, stuck to her body like a second skin. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and neck, and she was shaking. God, how she was shaking, racked by violent waves of cold that Gabriel could see even from where he stood. But what scared him most were her eyes. When she finally lifted her face toward him, probably having heard his footsteps, Gabriel saw empty eyes, so lost, so absent, that for one terrifying moment he thought she might be looking through him, not at him. "Hey," he said, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. He crouched beside her, trying not to startle her with sudden movements. "Hey, are you okay?" Stupid question. Obviously she wasn't okay. Nobody who was okay would be sitting on a dock during a storm, shaking so hard their teeth chattered audibly. She didn't answer, just kept staring at him with those empty eyes, as if he were a mirage that might disappear if she blinked. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel tried again, this time letting his voice go softer, gentler. He noticed then the way she favored one foot, how she kept her left ankle at an odd angle. "Your foot. Did you hurt it?" A slight nod, so small he almost missed it. "Okay." Gabriel took a deep breath, thinking quickly. She needed to get out of the rain, needed warmth, dry clothes, something hot to drink. She needed help. "I live close by. 5 minutes walk. Can I help you get there? You're going to freeze if you stay here." For a long moment she didn't respond. The rain kept falling relentlessly, the river roaring below them. Gabriel waited, his own body starting to shiver with cold, water running off his hood and down his face. Then finally she nodded again. A tiny movement, but it was there. "All right," Gabriel said, relieved. "I'm going to help you stand, okay? Carefully." He took off his rain jacket, the only thing still keeping him relatively dry, and draped it over her shoulders. It was way too big, swallowing her small frame, but it was better than nothing. When the fabric touched her shoulders, he felt her shudder again, but this time it didn't seem to be just from the cold. She pressed her face into the jacket's collar for a brief moment, so brief he might have imagined it, and took a deep breath, as if the smell of the fabric, the smell of him, was an anchor in a stormy sea. "Come on," Gabriel murmured, carefully sliding an arm around her waist and helping her up. She whimpered softly when she put weight on the injured ankle, and he immediately adjusted, taking more of her weight onto his own shoulders. Easy. No rush. They moved like a single stumbling entity across the dock, each step painful and slow. Gabriel could feel her body trembling against his, could hear her shallow, rapid breathing. When they reached the end of the dock and stepped onto solid ground, she stumbled, and he held her tighter, his fingers pressing gently into her waist. "I've got you," he said quietly, and for some reason those two simple words seemed to mean more than just the physical moment. "I'm not going to let you fall." She said nothing, but he felt something shift in her. A slight softening, a small relaxation of tense muscles. Trust, maybe, or just exhaustion so deep that she had no choice but to trust. The walk to his house felt like it lasted forever, and also no time at all. Gabriel was hyper-aware of every breath she took, every tremor, every small sound of pain when she accidentally put too much weight on the injured foot. When they finally reached his front door, his own arms were aching from the effort, but he didn't care. He opened the door and guided her inside, the house's warmth immediately enveloping them like an embrace. The contrast was so stark that they both gasped. "Sit down," Gabriel said, gently leading her to the couch. "I'll get towels and dry clothes." And he looked at her, really seeing her for the first time under proper light, and his heart squeezed again. "Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head quickly, almost in a panic. "No," she whispered, and that was the first word he'd heard her say. Her voice was hoarse, broken. "Please, no." "Okay," Gabriel agreed immediately, not wanting to frighten her. "No doctor, but I need to look at your ankle, and you need to get out of those wet clothes before you get even sicker." She nodded, and Gabriel ran upstairs, grabbing soft towels, clean clothes, one of his t-shirts and sweatpants that would be huge on her, but would be warm, and the first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet. When he came back down, she was still sitting exactly where he'd left her, shaking, staring at her hands in her lap as if she didn't recognize them. "The bathroom's right there," he pointed. "You can change. Take a hot shower if you want. I'll make tea." She took the clothes with trembling hands and stood, limping toward the bathroom. Gabriel watched until she closed the door, then finally allowed himself to take a deep breath. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why, of all things, was she sitting alone on a dock during a storm, looking like she'd given up on everything? He had no answers. But as he put the kettle on the stove and waited for the water to boil, a single certainty settled in his chest. He couldn't let her go until he was sure she'd be safe. Night fell over Maplewood like a heavy blanket, muffling the last sounds of the storm that was finally beginning to fade. Inside Gabriel's house, the silence was different. Not empty, but full. Full of things unsaid, of questions unasked, of a presence that completely transformed the space he'd inhabited alone for so long. Gigi had come out of the bathroom wearing the clothes he'd given her, the grey t-shirt hanging on her like a short dress, the sweatpants rolled several times at the waist and still dragging slightly on the floor. Her hair was damp, combed back, revealing a delicate face with high cheekbones and eyes that, though still guarded, no longer looked as empty as they had at the dock. She limped noticeably, favoring the ankle Gabriel had carefully wrapped. Not broken, he'd determined with relief, just twisted and swollen. She'd curled into the corner of the couch, legs folded beneath her, wrapped in one of the wool blankets Gabriel kept on the back. The fabric was soft and smelled of lavender from the sachet his late grandmother had always insisted on keeping with the linens. The firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that moved like living creatures, and the crackling of burning wood was the only consistent sound in the room. Gabriel had made tea, chamomile with honey, and placed a steaming mug on the coffee table within her reach. He'd also brought out a bowl of soup he'd made 2 days before, toast with butter, and some fruit. She hadn't touched anything yet, just stared at the tea mug as if trying to decide whether it was real. He didn't push her, didn't ask questions, just sat on the floor on the other side of the coffee table, far enough not to invade her space, close enough that she'd know she wasn't alone. His back was against the armchair, legs stretched out, and he held his own mug of tea, letting the warmth heat his palms still cold from the walk in the rain. The clock on the wall marked the hours with its steady tick-tock. 9 at night, 10, 11. Time moved slowly, thick as honey. Gabriel watched the fire, but he was hyper-aware of her every movement. The way her fingers finally closed around the mug, lifting it with both hands as if she needed the warmth more than the drink. The way she brought the steam close to her face, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply, letting the moist warmth caress her skin. The way her shoulders, which had been rigid and raised near her ears, slowly began to relax. "Thank you," she whispered suddenly, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it above the fire's crackling. Gabriel turned his head toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd come out of the bathroom. They were dark brown, almost black in the half-light, but with tiny golden flecks that caught the firelight. There was pain there, layers and layers of pain, but also something else, a tiny spark of relief maybe, or gratitude. "You don't need to thank me," he answered softly, keeping his voice low and unthreatening. Anyone would have done the same. She shook her head, a small but definite denial. "No," she said. "Most people would have walked right past, or called the police, or—" she swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the mug tighter, "or tried to take me somewhere I didn't want to go." Gabriel felt something heavy settle in his stomach. There was a story there, a painful story full of people who'd failed her, who'd hurt her when they should have protected her. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, choosing each word carefully. "But you're safe here, I promise. You can stay as long as you need." Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes but didn't fall. She blinked rapidly, turning her face toward the fire, and took a small sip of tea. Her lips touched the rim of the mug, and she closed her eyes again as if savoring not just the taste, but the simple act of drinking something warm and comforting. Gabriel looked back at the fire, giving her privacy to process her emotions. He could hear her breathing, shallow at first, then gradually deepening, calming. He could hear the small sound when she finally picked up a piece of bread and brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Maybe she hadn't. The storm outside had reduced to a gentle drizzle, occasional drops tapping against the windows like delicate fingers. The house groaned and sighed with familiar nighttime sounds, the settling of old boards, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the persistent tick-tock of the clock. "My name is Gigi," she said suddenly, breaking the silence again. Her voice was firmer now, fed perhaps by the food, the warmth, the simple fact of being seen as human and not as a problem to be solved. "Gigi," Gabriel repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It was beautiful, delicate but with an underlying strength. "I'm Gabriel." "I know," she said, and there was the ghost of a smile at the edges of her mouth. "You told me, back at the dock. I think I was listening even when I couldn't respond." Gabriel nodded, glad that she'd heard, that some part of her had still been there even when she seemed so lost. "You can sleep in my room," he offered. "I'll take the couch, or there's a guest room upstairs if you'd rather have more privacy." Gigi looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. She must have been looking for signs of danger, for hidden intentions, for all the things someone had clearly taught her to fear. What she saw, Gabriel didn't know, but something in her expression softened. "I can stay here," she said, pointing to the couch where she sat. "If that's okay. She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Don't want to be alone. But I also don't want to be more of a bother than I already am." "You're not a bother," Gabriel said firmly, wanting her to believe it. "But if you want to stay on the couch, then I'll stay over there." He pointed to the recliner across the room. "That way you're not alone, but you have your space." She nodded, something like gratitude flooding her face. Gabriel stood and gathered more blankets, pillows, preparing the couch for her like it was a bed. He adjusted the pillows, smoothed the blankets, making sure everything was soft and comfortable. When he finished, he stepped back. "There," he said. "If you need anything during the night, anything at all, just call me." Gigi slid down under the blanket, wrapping herself in it like a cocoon. Only her face was visible, framed by the dark blue fabric. She looked so small, so vulnerable that Gabriel felt his chest tighten. He settled into the recliner, pulling a thin blanket over himself. The chair wasn't as comfortable as his bed, but he'd slept in worse places. And anyway, he doubted he could sleep properly knowing there was an injured, frightened woman in his living room. The firelight gradually dimmed, the flames turning to embers that glowed red-orange in the darkness. The house cooled a few degrees but was still warm, welcoming. Gabriel could hear Gigi's breathing from across the room, still not completely relaxed, but calmer than before. Hours passed. Gabriel was almost asleep when he heard a sound, a small, muffled whimper. His eyes opened immediately and he looked toward the couch. Gigi was moving restlessly, caught in some nightmare he couldn't see. "No," she murmured, her voice tight with fear. "Please, don't." Gabriel stood silently and crossed the room, kneeling beside the couch. He didn't touch her, not wanting to frighten her further, but kept his voice calm and steady. "Gigi," he said gently, "you're safe. You're in Maplewood, at my house. You're safe." She woke with a start, eyes flying open, body tensing. For a moment she seemed not to know where she was, panic clearly visible on her face. Then her eyes focused on Gabriel, kneeling there so close, and something in her calmed. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Don't apologize," Gabriel said, and this time slowly, telegraphing every movement, he reached out and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from her shoulders. His fingers briefly brushed her arm through the t-shirt fabric, the lightest, most accidental touch. But she felt it. He saw the shiver run through her body, saw her eyes widen slightly, not from fear, from something different, something neither of them was ready to name. Their eyes met in the darkness. Gabriel was so close he could see every detail of her face, the light freckles across the bridge of her nose, the small dimple in her chin, the way her lips were slightly parted. He could feel her warmth, could hear the quickened rhythm of her breathing. Neither of them moved, neither pulled back, but they didn't move closer either. Not yet. The moment stretched, charged and heavy, full of possibilities that couldn't yet be explored. Gabriel finally pulled back, but slowly, reluctantly. "Sleep," he whispered. "I'm here." And as he returned to the recliner, As he closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, a single truth settled in his heart. His life had changed at that dock. And whatever came next, he couldn't imagine letting her go. 3 weeks had passed since that night on the couch. 3 weeks since Gigi had appeared in his life like a puzzle wrapped in pain and silence. She'd stayed at Gabriel's house for 5 days. 5 days of cautious conversations, of shared meals, of moments when their hands touched accidentally, and both pretended the electricity between them didn't exist. On the 6th day, she'd announced she needed to find work, needed to start rebuilding her life. Gabriel hadn't stopped her, though every fiber of his being wanted to ask her to stay. He'd helped her find a tiny apartment above the old bakery in downtown Maplewood, a small space but full of light, with windows overlooking Main Street and a permanent smell of fresh bread that drifted up through the floorboards. And then, for 3 weeks, Gabriel hadn't seen her. He told himself it was to give her space, to let her find her own way without feeling the pressure of gratitude or obligation. But the truth was he was scared. Scared that if he reached out too soon, she'd disappear like smoke through his fingers. Until that Thursday morning. Gabriel was driving down Main Street, on his way to the hardware store to buy new hinges for a cabinet he was restoring, when he saw her through the bakery window. He hit the brakes so abruptly that the car behind him honked irritably, but Gabriel barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on her, on that figure who'd occupied his thoughts every minute of every day since she'd left his house. Gigi stood behind the bakery counter, wearing a white apron stained with flour, her hair pulled into a messy bun on top of her head with rebellious strands escaping around her face. And her cheeks, God, her cheeks were dusted with flour, 2 white smudges that made her look younger, lighter, almost happy. Gabriel's heart did something strange in his chest, a leap, a twist, something that was part relief and part desire, so intense it took his breath away. He parked the car haphazardly in the nearest spot he could find and crossed the street without thinking, without planning what he'd say, driven only by the urgent need to be near her again. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the smell of baked bread wrapped around him like an embrace, yeast and butter, cinnamon and sugar, that incomparable aroma that meant home and comfort. The bakery was small but welcoming, with exposed brick walls, worn wooden tables scattered throughout the space, and shelves full of breads, cakes and pastries that looked like they'd come from a dream. There were only 2 other customers, an elderly man reading the newspaper in a corner, and a young woman with a baby in her arms. Soft music played through an old radio on the counter, something classical that Gabriel couldn't identify, but that perfectly matched the warm atmosphere of the place. Gigi was taking an order, her head tilted as she listened to the woman with the baby explain that she wanted a birthday cake for the weekend. She held a pen with flour-stained fingers, carefully writing in a small notebook, asking questions about flavors and decorations in a soft but confident voice Gabriel had never heard from her before. Then she looked up, perhaps sensing the weight of his gaze, and their eyes met across the bakery space. Time stopped. Gabriel saw recognition wash over her face. First surprise, her eyes widening slightly, her mouth opening in a small, silent, "Oh." Then something softer, warmer, spreading across her features like the sun rising over the horizon. Her cheeks, already pink from the heat of the ovens in back, flushed even deeper. She stopped mid-sentence, the pen frozen above the paper, completely still for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then slowly, as if coming out of a trance, she blinked and returned her attention to the customer, finishing the order with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Gabriel waited, leaning casually against the wall near the door, but there was nothing casual about the way his heart pounded against his ribs or how his palms were sweaty. He watched her every movement, the way she smiled at the woman, how she handed a sugar cookie to the baby who immediately began happily gumming it, how she wiped her hands on her apron before accepting payment. When the woman left with the baby in her arms, chiming the bell again, only Gabriel and the elderly man remained. The old man was so absorbed in his newspaper he didn't even look up. Gigi turned to Gabriel, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other across the glass counter full of golden croissants and muffins stuffed with red berries, across the space that seemed both too large and too small at once. "Hi," she finally said, and her voice was shy, almost whispered, but there was a smile at the corners of her mouth that made Gabriel's chest tighten. "Hi," he replied, pushing away from the wall and walking to the counter. Each step seemed to take forever. "You look—" He stopped, searching for the right words, then gave up trying to be eloquent. "You look so much better." Her smile grew, reaching her eyes this time, making those golden flecks shine. "I'm trying," she said, and there was pride in her voice, quiet, but real. "Mrs. Chen, the owner, gave me a chance. I've never worked in a bakery before, but she said it was more about willingness to learn than experience." "You look natural," Gabriel said, and it was true. There was something different about her now, something that wasn't there even on the last day she'd spent at his house. A light, a spark of life coming back. Gigi laughed softly, raising a hand to touch her face, and in doing so, leaving another flour smudge on the tip of her nose. "I'm a mess," she said, but there was no shame in the words, just amusement. "You're beautiful," Gabriel said before he could censor himself, and the words came out more intense, more loaded than he intended. Gigi's smile faltered for a moment, not disappearing but transforming into something different, something deeper. Her eyes locked on his, and Gabriel saw vulnerability there, but also curiosity, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Want something?" she asked, and her voice was a little hoarse. "Coffee, a piece of pie? I made an apple one this morning that turned out, well, Mrs. Chen said it was almost perfect." "Coffee," Gabriel said, not because he was thirsty, but because it meant he could stay, could prolong this moment. "And a piece of that almost perfect pie." Gigi nodded and turned to make the coffee, and Gabriel took the opportunity to really observe her. She'd gained weight, not much, but enough that clothes no longer seemed to hang on her body. There was color in her cheeks beyond the flour, and the way she moved, though still slightly favoring the ankle that had been injured, had a grace to it that wasn't there before. She placed a steaming mug of coffee on the counter, along with a generous slice of apple pie that smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg. Their hands touched briefly as she passed the plate, and both felt it, that spark, that electric connection they'd been denying for weeks. "How much do I owe you?" Gabriel asked, reaching for his wallet. "No," Gigi said quickly, shaking her head. "Please. After everything you did, I could never charge you." "Gigi." "Gabriel," she interrupted him, and there was firmness in her voice now. "Let me do this. Let me give you something, even if it's just coffee and pie." He could have argued, should have argued, but something about the way she looked at him, about the quiet pride she wore like fragile armor, made him nod and put away his wallet. "Thank you," he said softly. Gabriel sat at one of the tables near the window, and though there were other customers to serve, a woman coming in for French bread, a teenager ordering a donut, he noticed how Gigi's eyes kept returning to him. Small stolen glances while she worked, as if she needed to confirm he was still there, that he wasn't a dream or a mirage. And Gabriel looked back. Impossible not to look. Impossible not to notice the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, how she laughed softly when the teenager made a joke about the powdered sugar on his shirt, how she moved through the small bakery as if dancing a choreography only she knew. The pie was delicious, the crust crispy and buttery, the filling sweet but with a touch of tartness from the apples, the spices perfectly balanced. Gabriel ate slowly, savoring each bite, making it last. When there was finally no more reason to stay, when the pie was gone and the coffee cold, he stood reluctantly. Gigi was wiping down the counter and she stopped when he approached. "I should go," he said, and hated how the words sounded, final, definitive. "Okay," she replied, but there was disappointment in her eyes she couldn't quite hide. "Can I—" Gabriel hesitated, then decided to be brave. "Can I come back? Tomorrow, maybe?" Gigi's face lit up like someone had turned on a candle inside her. "I'd like that," she said, and her voice carried so much relief it made Gabriel's heart ache. "I really would." Gabriel nodded, smiling, and when he turned to leave, when the bell chimed above his head, he looked back one last time. Gigi stood behind the counter, one hand raised in a small wave, flour still dusting her cheeks, and in that moment, Gabriel knew with absolute certainty that he was falling fast, falling hard, falling in a way that would change everything, and for the first time in years he wasn't afraid. Gabriel kept his promise. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the one after that too. It became a ritual. Every morning at 10, when the bakery's initial rush died down and before the lunch crowd started, Gabriel would walk through the door with the bell chiming his arrival. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee and whatever the special of the day was, always sat at the same table near the window, and always stayed at least an hour, sometimes two, working on his woodworking projects in a sketchbook or simply watching the world go by while Gigi worked. But mostly he watched her. Watched the way she interacted with customers, shy at first, but gradually becoming more confident, her smile more genuine each day. Watched how she learned, absorbing every instruction from Mrs. Chen like a sponge, her hands becoming more skilled with dough, more sure when decorating cakes. Watched the small changes, how she started wearing a soft pink lipstick, how she tied her hair with a colorful scarf instead of just a plain elastic, how her eyes no longer automatically looked away when someone looked directly at her. And they talked, not much at first, just casual words about the weather, about the funny, regular customers, about the new recipes Gigi was trying. But slowly, gradually, the conversations deepened. Gigi started asking questions about Gabriel's woodworking, and he'd talk about the satisfaction of transforming raw wood into something beautiful and functional. Gabriel would ask about her dreams, and she'd mention shyly that she'd always wanted to paint, that she'd taken art classes in college before. There was always a before she didn't finish, an invisible wall she built around certain parts of her story. Gabriel never pushed, but he waited, patient, steady, present. 6 weeks after that first visit to the bakery, on a rainy night that eerily echoed that first storm, everything changed. Gabriel was waiting outside the bakery when Gigi closed, holding an umbrella big enough for two. Rain fell in silver curtains, drumming on the sidewalks and roofs with a hypnotic rhythm. The streets were deserted, shops closed, only a few yellow lights from lit windows piercing the growing darkness. When Gigi came out, locking the door behind her, she stopped at seeing him there. Surprise and something else, and something that looked like gratitude and terror mixed together, passed across her face. "You didn't have to," she started, but he shook his head. "I know," Gabriel said simply, "but I wanted to." They walked side by side through the wet streets, sharing the umbrella, their shoulders occasionally touching when one had to dodge a particularly deep puddle. Her apartment was only 5 blocks away, but they walked slowly as if neither wanted the moment to end. When they reached the building, Gigi hesitated at the door, keys in hand, biting her lower lip in the way Gabriel had learned meant she was wrestling with some internal decision. "Do you want to come up?" she finally asked, the words coming out in a rush. "Just for coffee? Or tea? Just to get out of the rain for a minute?" Gabriel knew it was more than just an invitation for coffee. It was a line being crossed, a door being opened to a more intimate, more vulnerable space. He could say no, could keep things safe and at a distance, could protect them both from whatever complications would come. "I'd love to," he said instead. Her apartment was exactly as he'd imagined, small but carefully kept. The living room and kitchen were practically one open space, with a large window overlooking the street. There was a second-hand couch covered with a colorful crocheted blanket, a coffee table with a stack of art books, and on the walls were paintings. Gabriel stopped, breath catching in his throat, absorbing what he saw. They were watercolors, most of them, soft landscapes in blues and greens, abstract portraits of faces that were more emotion than defined features, street scenes that captured ephemeral moments of light and shadow. They were beautiful, not perfect, but raw and honest and full of feeling. "You did these?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Gigi nodded, taking off her wet jacket and hanging it near the door. Her hands trembled slightly. "I started painting again a few weeks ago," she said quietly. "I used to do it all the time before—" She stopped, that familiar wall going up again. But this time something in her seemed to give way. "Before my marriage," she finished, and the word marriage came out like broken glass, sharp and painful. "Before I met Marcus." Gabriel went very still, barely daring to breathe, sensing that this was the moment she'd been holding back, that she finally trusted him enough to share. Gigi moved to the window, looking out at the rain, arms crossed over her chest in a self-protective gesture. Gabriel stayed where he was, giving her space, but remaining present. "We met in college," she began, her voice distant as if narrating someone else's life. "He was charming, attentive. Everyone thought we were the perfect couple, even my parents, especially my parents." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "In the beginning it was good, great even. He'd bring me flowers, tell me I was beautiful, made me feel special." Her voice dropped lower. "Then we got married, and it was like a switch flipped." Gabriel's heart squeezed painfully. He already knew on some level what was coming, but hearing it, seeing the raw pain on her face as she told it, was different. "It started with small things," Gigi continued. "Comments about my clothes being too revealing, questions about where I was, who I was talking to. He'd check my phone. Then he started controlling the money. I couldn't buy anything without permission, couldn't see my friends, couldn't paint because he said it was a waste of time and resources." Her hands gripped her own arms, leaving white marks on the skin. "And then came the anger, the violence." Her voice broke. "The first time he hit me, I was in shock. Couldn't believe it was happening. He cried afterward, begged forgiveness, said it would never happen again. I believed him because I wanted to believe." Tears ran down her face now, silent but steady. "But it happened again and again, and each time was worse. He isolated me completely. My family lived in another state and he made sure we rarely saw them. My friends stopped calling because I always cancelled plans. I had no one, nowhere to go, no money. I felt so trapped, so broken." Gabriel felt something fierce and protective surge in his chest, a rage directed not at her but at the man who'd done this, who'd taken this incredible woman and tried to destroy her. "How did you get out?" he asked gently, keeping his voice carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions inside him. Gigi took a shaky breath. "One night he hurt me bad, really bad." She touched her ankle unconsciously, that same ankle that had been injured when Gabriel found her. "I managed to get out while he was sleeping, grabbed just my purse, my documents, and left. I didn't know where to go. I just drove. Drove until the car ran out of gas somewhere near here. And then I walked, in the rain, with no destination. I just wanted to disappear. Until the dock," Gabriel said quietly, understanding now. Understanding why she'd been sitting there, so lost, so absent. She'd been contemplating whether to just let the rain and river take her, whether it would be easier than continuing to fight. Gigi nodded, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "And then you showed up," she whispered. "Like an angel. Like the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making." Gabriel finally moved, crossing the room in a few long strides. He stopped in front of her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, to see every detail of her tear-stained face. "Look at me," he said softly. She raised her eyes, and he saw all the pain there, all the shame, all the fear that he'd see her differently now, that he'd judge her, that he'd consider her broken and worthless. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Gabriel said, each word deliberate and true. "What you went through doesn't define you. What defines you is that you survived, that you got out, that you're here, rebuilding your life with your own hands." Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he raised his hand. His fingers brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. Her skin was soft and warm beneath his touch, and he felt her tremble, not from fear, but from something completely different. "Is he looking for you?" Gabriel asked, needing to know, needing to understand the danger. Gigi shook her head. "I don't know. Probably. Marcus doesn't like losing control. But I changed my phone. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not even my parents know exactly where I am. I need time. Time to be strong again." Gabriel nodded, his hand still on her face, his thumb now tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made Gigi's heart race. "You're already strong," he said. "Stronger than you think." They stood like that for a long moment, so close they shared the air, so connected that Gabriel could feel her pulse racing under his palm. His eyes dropped to her lips, full, slightly trembling, and he saw the exact moment when her breath stopped, When she realized where he was looking, he could kiss her. God, how he wanted to kiss her, wanted to close that tiny distance, wanted to taste, wanted to show her with actions instead of words how much she meant to him. But not now, not when she'd just poured out her heart, when she was vulnerable and raw. She deserved more than a kiss born from heightened emotions and tears. She deserved to be courted, valued, chosen when she was whole, and not just when she was broken. So instead, Gabriel did something different. He moved his hand from her face to her hair, picked up a strand that had escaped from the scarf, and gently tucked it behind her ear. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin there, and he saw her eyes close briefly, her lips part in an almost inaudible sigh. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me with your story, for letting me see the real you." When he let his hand fall, when he took a step back, creating space between them again, he saw confusion and maybe disappointment flash quickly across Gigi's face. "I should go," he said, though every part of him screamed to stay. "It's late and you've had a long day." Gigi nodded but caught his hand before he could pull away completely, her fingers interlaced with his, holding firmly. "Gabriel," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. For not running when I told you." He squeezed her hand back, briefly bringing it to his lips and pressing the lightest kiss against her knuckles. "Never," he promised. "I'll never run from you." And as he walked down the stairs, as he stepped out into the rain that still fell gently, he knew he'd just made a promise he intended to keep, no matter what happened. The weeks following that rainy night brought a subtle but undeniable shift in the relationship between Gabriel and Gigi. It was as if, by sharing her truth, she'd removed an invisible barrier that had separated them. Now when they sat together in the bakery, there was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. An intimacy that went beyond words. Gabriel continued visiting every day, but now sometimes stayed until closing, helping Gigi clean the tables, turn up the chairs, sweep the floor while she closed out the register. They developed a silent choreography, moving around each other with an acute awareness of where the other was, their bodies nearly touching, but never quite. It was a delicious torture. There was the moment when Gabriel reached for a cake pan on the high shelf, and Gigi squeezed behind him to pass, her hand lightly touching his back to keep her balance. He felt the warmth of that touch through his shirt for hours afterward. There was the afternoon when Gigi tripped on a rug and Gabriel caught her, his arms around her waist, their faces inches apart, both frozen in that position for seconds that felt like minutes before she straightened with flaming cheeks. There were the times when their fingers touched while making change, sharing a piece of paper, both reaching for the same thing at the same time. And each time, that electricity, that spark that made hearts race and skin tingle. Gabriel was in love, completely, irrevocably in love. And with each passing day, it became harder to hide it. He knew he needed to act, needed to show her somehow concretely what he felt. But how? How do you show someone who's been through so much trauma that your love isn't like what she knew before? That it's safe, steady, unconditional? The answer came to him one night when he was in his workshop in the basement, working on an oak table that had been commissioned. His hands moved automatically through the familiar process of sanding and polishing, but his mind was elsewhere, going back to that morning weeks ago when he'd first seen Gigi wearing his shirt. That image was burned into his brain like a photograph seared onto the retina. The way the blue fabric fell over her, the vulnerability and trust mixed in her gaze, the moment when everything changed between them, even though neither of them knew it yet. The shirt. It always came back to the shirt. Gabriel stopped sanding, an idea taking shape. He needed something that symbolized that moment, that turning point, something small enough for her to carry, but significant enough that she'd understand. The next morning, instead of going straight to the bakery, Gabriel drove to the neighboring town where there was a jewelry store he knew. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Hoffman, was known for custom work, for transforming ideas into reality with metal and stone. "Gabriel, Mr." Hoffman exclaimed when he entered, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The shop smelled of polished metal and lemon oil used on the dark wooden counters. "It's been a while. What can I do for you today?" Gabriel explained what he wanted. A pendant, small and delicate in the shape of a shirt. Silver, if possible, with details fine enough to show the buttons, the collar, the fabric folds. And her name, Gigi, engraved on the back in elegant cursive. Mr. Hoffman listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions about size and style. When Gabriel finished, the old jeweler looked at him with wise eyes that had seen decades of people in love walking into his shop. "This is for someone special," he said, not a question. "Very special," Gabriel confirmed, feeling warmth creep up his neck. "It'll take about 2 weeks," Mr. Hoffman said. "I'll do it carefully. Something like this deserves attention to detail." Gabriel agreed to the price and timeline, leaving the shop with a nervous anticipation settling in his chest. 2 weeks, 14 days to plan how he'd give it to her, what he'd say, how to express everything he felt without scaring her or pressuring her. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of daily visits to the bakery, of conversations that deepened more and more, of stolen moments that carried unspoken promises. Gabriel noticed new things about Gigi each day, how she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, how she always gave extra pieces of cake to children who came with their parents, how her eyes sought his across the bakery as if she needed to confirm he was still there. And she noticed things about him too. He could see it in the way she smiled when he arrived, how she prepared his coffee exactly the way he liked it, without having to ask, how her fingers lingered an extra second when she passed him his cup. Finally, 14 days later, Gabriel returned to the jewelry store. Mr. Hoffman greeted him with a satisfied smile and a small navy blue velvet box. "Open it," he encouraged. Gabriel opened the box, and his breath died in his throat. The pendant was perfect, even more beautiful than he'd imagined. The small silver shirt hung from a delicate chain, every detail meticulously crafted. You could see the tiny buttons, the carefully folded collar, even the suggested seams on the sides. And when he turned it over, there was her name in elegant cursive, Gigi, engraved with a grace that made his heart squeeze. "It's perfect," Gabriel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good," Mr. Hoffman replied, satisfied. "Now go and give it to her. And Gabriel?" He waited until Gabriel looked at him. "Don't be afraid to say what you feel. Life's too short to leave important words unsaid." Gabriel nodded, carefully tucking the box into his jacket's inner pocket, feeling its weight against his heart. The next morning, Gabriel arrived at the bakery earlier than usual. It was only 8 o'clock, and Main Street in Maplewood was just beginning to wake. Some shops still had their lights off, and only a few occasional cars passed through the streets. The bakery, however, was alive, lights on, the smell of fresh bread already perfuming the air. Through the window, Gabriel could see Gigi behind the counter, arranging croissants on a display tray, her hair pulled into a braid that fell over one shoulder. He took a deep breath, felt the outline of the box in his pocket, and went inside. The bell chimed, and Gigi looked up, surprise visible on her face. "Gabriel," she said, and there was pure pleasure in her voice. "You're early. I haven't even finished setting everything up yet." "I know," he said, walking to the counter. His heart pounded so hard he was certain she could hear it. I wanted to talk to you before it got busy." Something in his tone made Gigi stop what she was doing. She wiped her hands on her apron and came closer, her eyes searching his with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked like nervousness. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," Gabriel said quickly. "More than okay. He pulled the box from his pocket, holding it between them. "I have something for you." Gigi's eyes fell to the box, then back to his face, wide. "Gabriel, you didn't need to." "I know I didn't need to," he interrupted gently, "but I wanted to. Please, just open it." With trembling hands, Gigi took the box. She opened it slowly, carefully, and when she saw what was inside, her breath stopped completely. For a long moment she just stared, her eyes tracing every detail of the small silver pendant. "It's a shirt," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your shirt," Gabriel corrected. "Or, well, my shirt that you wore that morning, when everything changed." Tears glistened in Gigi's eyes as she lifted the pendant from the box, letting it swing on the chain, the silver catching the light and casting small reflections on the walls. "You remember," she said, and it wasn't a question. "How could I forget?" Gabriel replied, his voice heavy with all the emotion he'd been holding back. "That image is burned into my mind. You standing in my living room, wearing my shirt, looking at me with those eyes that were part fear and part trust. It was the moment I knew." "Knew what?" Gigi asked, though Gabriel suspected she already knew the answer. He took a step closer, eliminating the space between them until only the counter separated them. "That you would change my life," he said simply. "That I'd never be the same after meeting you." A tear escaped and rolled down Gigi's cheek. Gabriel raised his hand and wiped it away with his thumb, his touch lingering on her skin. "May I?" he asked, indicating the necklace. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned, offering the back of her neck to him. Gabriel took the necklace from her hands and, with surprisingly steady fingers considering how his heart was racing, placed it around her neck. Her skin was warm under his fingers as he worked the clasp. Fine little hairs at the nape of her neck stood on end at his touch, and he heard her breathing quicken. The pendant fell into the hollow of her throat, resting just above her heart. When he finished, Gabriel didn't immediately step back. His hands remained on her shoulders for a moment, feeling her warmth through the thin fabric of her blouse. He could smell her perfume, vanilla and something floral he couldn't name, mixed with the scent of flour and powdered sugar that always surrounded her now. Gigi turned slowly, and when their eyes met, Gabriel saw everything he needed to see. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Desire, affection, maybe even love. "Thank you," she whispered, one hand rising to touch the pendant, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "This means... You don't know how much this means." "I think I do," Gabriel said softly. They were so close now, so dangerously close. Gabriel could count every eyelash, could see the tiny golden flecks in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. His eyes dropped to her lips. They were parted, trembling slightly. All he had to do was lean in just a few inches, and he could finally know what it was like to kiss her. But then the door's bell chimed, breaking the moment like shattering glass. A customer walked in, Mrs. Martinez from the grocery store, and they both stepped back quickly, the spell broken but not forgotten. "Good morning," Mrs. Martinez greeted cheerfully, not noticing the tension in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez," Gigi replied, her voice a little hoarse, her hands still touching the pendant. Gabriel retreated to his usual table, but his eyes never left Gigi as she served the customer. And every time she looked at him, she touched the necklace, as if remembering, as if confirming it was real. And Gabriel knew that even though the kiss hadn't happened yet, they'd crossed another threshold, one from which there was no going back. The pendant never left Gigi's neck. Gabriel noticed how she constantly touched it, an unconscious, comforting gesture, as if she needed to confirm it was still there. When she was nervous, her fingers played with it. When she was thoughtful, she held it between her thumb and forefinger, turning it gently. And when she looked at Gabriel, which she did with increasing frequency, she always touched it, as if the necklace were an invisible thread connecting the two of them. 3 days after Gabriel gave her the gift, Gigi mentioned casually during one of their conversations that she'd finally set up a small painting corner in her apartment. She'd bought paints, brushes, some canvases. She was starting to paint again, something she hadn't done since before the marriage. "I'd love to see," Gabriel said, and the words came out before he could censor them, before he could think about whether it was appropriate to invite himself like that. But Gigi just smiled, that smile that now reached her eyes, that completely transformed her face. "Come tonight," she said. "After I close, I'll show you." And so, that evening, Gabriel found himself climbing the familiar stairs to her apartment, his heart pounding with an anticipation that was part nervousness, part excitement. There was something different about being there at night, by invitation, with intention, not by accident or emergency, but because she wanted him there. When Gigi opened the door, Gabriel had to make a conscious effort not to let his jaw drop. She'd changed after work, no longer wearing the practical bakery uniform, but a light cotton blouse in a pale blue that vaguely reminded him of his shirt, and linen pants that flowed when she moved. Her hair was down, falling in waves over her shoulders, and there were paint stains on her hands and forearms. Bright yellow, deep red, a streak of blue on her wrist. "Sorry," she said, following his gaze to the paint stains. "I was working before you got here and lost track of time." "Don't apologize," Gabriel said, stepping inside. You look exactly how you should look." The apartment had changed since the last time he'd been there. The corner near the large window had been transformed into a small studio, a wooden easel holding a blank canvas, a makeshift table covered with tubes of paint in every imaginable color, brushes of various sizes in glass jars, stained rags, cups of cloudy water. The light coming through the window was perfect, that golden late afternoon light that artists call magic hour. And on the walls, there were new paintings, many of them, some still drying, others already finished and hung. Gabriel approached slowly, studying each one with the attention they deserved. There was a landscape of Maplewood, Main Street at dawn, fog still clinging to the rooftops, the first lights beginning to turn on in windows. There was an abstract portrait that seemed to capture emotion more than physical features, sadness and hope mixed in strokes of blue and gold. There was a still life of breads and croissants that were so real he could almost smell them. But it was the last painting that made Gabriel stop completely. It was him. Not a traditional portrait, but something more impressionistic. Him sitting at his usual table in the bakery, sunlight coming through the window, illuminating half his face, while the other half remained in shadow. His head was tilted over his sketchbook, a pen in hand, completely absorbed in his work. But what caught Gabriel wasn't the physical details, but the emotion she'd managed to put on the canvas. There was a softness there, a tenderness in the way she'd painted him that made his chest tighten. "When did you do this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Gigi came closer, standing beside him, so close their shoulders nearly touched. "Last week," she admitted. "You were so focused, you didn't even notice I was watching you. I hope you don't mind." I couldn't resist. "The light was perfect and you were—" She stopped, searching for words. "I was what?" Gabriel turned to look at her, needing to hear, needing to know how she saw him. "You were beautiful," she said simply, and the blush that crept up her neck and cheeks was adorable. "And at peace. Like that moment, that place was exactly where you were supposed to be." Gabriel didn't know what to say. No one had ever painted him before. No one had ever looked at him closely enough to capture not just his features, but his essence. "Can I watch you paint?" he asked. "Now, if you don't mind." Gigi looked surprised, but then smiled. "Sure," she said, "but you'll get bored. Painting is slow. It can take hours." "I have hours," Gabriel replied, and it was true. He would have given all the hours in the world just to be in this space with her. Gigi settled in front of the easel, taking a new canvas and securing it in place. Gabriel pulled up a chair and sat a few feet away, close enough to observe, far enough not to interfere. She began mixing paints on a stained wooden palette, small amounts of different colors, testing shades, creating new hues by combining blue with white, red with yellow. Her movements were deliberate but fluid, like a dance only she knew. "What are you going to paint?" Gabriel asked. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "Sometimes I just start and let the paint tell me what it wants to be." And then she began, the first brushstroke across the blank canvas, a broad sweep of cerulean blue that could be sky or water or anything. Then another and another, colors building, shapes beginning to emerge from the chaos. Gabriel watched, fascinated. There was something hypnotic about the way she worked, completely focused, completely present, lost in her own world of color and form. She bit her lower lip when concentrating, as he'd noticed many times before. Sometimes she stepped back, tilting her head to study her work from a different angle. Other times, she leaned so close to the canvas that her nose almost touched it. Time stretched and folded. Minutes turned into an hour. The light through the window changed from gold to amber to deep violet as the sun set. Gigi turned on a lamp, adjusting it so it illuminated the canvas without creating harsh shadows. Gabriel said nothing, asked no questions, just watched. And in his watching there was an intimacy that was almost physical, as if by witnessing this act of creation, he was being allowed to see the truest part of her. What began to emerge on the canvas was surprising. Not a landscape or portrait, but something abstract. Waves of blue and green that could be water, touches of white that could be foam or clouds, and through it all a figure, barely more than a silhouette, standing at the edge of something, looking into the unknown. It was the dock. It was her. It was that moment when Gabriel found her, captured not literally but emotionally. "Gigi," he whispered, and there was reverence in his voice. She stopped, the brush suspended in air, and looked at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were bright, intense, still half lost in the creative process. "Is it too much?" she asked. "I know it's heavy." "It's perfect," Gabriel said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Gigi put the brush back in the jar and turned to face him completely. There was paint on her cheek now, a smudge of blue she'd rubbed without realizing. Her hands were covered in colors, a rainbow of emotion marked on her skin. "Thank you," she said, "for staying, for watching, for not thinking it's weird that I need to do this." Gabriel stood, crossing the small distance between them. When he was standing in front of her, when he could see the small paint stains, not just on her hands, but on her arms, on her neck, even one at the corner of her mouth, he felt something loosen in his chest. A restraint he'd been holding for weeks, months. "May I?" he asked, raising his hand, indicating the blue smudge on her cheek. She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. Gabriel touched her face gently, his thumb rubbing softly at the paint, but it didn't come off completely, it just smeared, creating a streak of color across her skin that somehow made her look even more beautiful. "It won't come off," he murmured, but didn't remove his hand. Instead, he let his palm rest against her cheek, feeling the warmth there, feeling the way she leaned slightly into his touch. "Gabriel," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer, like a request, like permission. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice rough, his other hand rising to frame the other side of her face, holding her gently but firmly. "If you don't want this, tell me to stop and I will." "I don't want you to stop," Gigi replied, her hands rising to rest on his chest, staining his shirt with paint, and he didn't care one bit. I want you to stay. I want—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Gabriel leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to change her mind, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in too, and when their lips finally met, it was like completing a circuit, like lighting a flame that had been smoldering for so long. The kiss started soft, tentative, exploring, learning the taste and texture of each other. Her lips were soft and tasted faintly of the mint tea she'd had earlier. His were firm but gentle, moving against hers with a careful restraint that spoke of respect as much as desire. But then something shifted. Gigi made a small sound in the back of her throat, half sigh, half moan, and her hands moved from his chest to his neck, to his hair, pulling him closer. And Gabriel, who'd been holding himself back for so long, finally allowed himself to feel completely. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him until there was no space between their bodies. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more needed. Their tongues met, tasting, exploring. His hands were in her hair, on her back, on the curve of her waist. Her hands were everywhere. His shoulders, his neck, down his back, holding him with a strength that surprised and thrilled him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, hearts racing. Gabriel rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, trying to regain some control over himself. "Wow," Gigi whispered, and he could hear the smile in her voice even without seeing. "Yeah," he agreed, opening his eyes to find hers. "Wow really sums it up." They stood like that for a long moment, embracing, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. The lamplight cast soft shadows around them, and through the window Maplewood was slowly falling asleep, lights turning on in windows as families settled in for the night. "Stay," Gigi said suddenly, the word coming out in an urgent whisper. Not for anything other than being here, but stay. I don't want this moment to end yet." Gabriel kissed her forehead softly. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. They settled on the couch, Gigi curled against Gabriel's chest, her head resting where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, his other hand interlaced with hers. Both hands stained with paint now, their colors mixed just as their lives were beginning to mix. And as the night deepened outside, as Maplewood slept, they stayed like that. not saying much, not needing to say much, just existing together in the comfortable silence of two hearts finally finding their way to each other. But they both knew, though they didn't say it aloud, that something had changed tonight. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back to what they were before that kiss. 2 weeks had passed since that first kiss in Gigi's apartment, and the world seemed to have changed color, brighter, more vivid, more full of possibilities. They hadn't rushed anything, hadn't hurried. Instead, they let the relationship unfold naturally, like a flower opening petal by petal. There had been more kisses, of course, stolen kisses behind the bakery counter when no one was looking, long, slow kisses on Gigi's couch while watching movies neither of them really paid attention to. Goodbye kisses that lingered in the doorway until both were laughing and breathless. But they hadn't gone beyond that. Gabriel was determined to let Gigi set the pace, to never pressure her, to make it clear that whatever happened between them would be her choice as much as his. Until that Friday night. Gabriel had invited Gigi to dinner at his house. Nothing elaborate, just homemade pasta and wine, but it was the first time she'd be there since that memorable morning weeks ago. There was a significance to it that both felt but didn't mention. When Gigi arrived wearing a simple summer dress in a dark green that made her eyes shine and her hair loose in waves Gabriel loved running his fingers through, he had to remind himself to breathe. She was beautiful, not in the polished, put-together way fashion magazines promoted, but in a real, natural, absolutely her kind of way. "Hi," she said, and there was nervousness in her voice he didn't expect. "Hi," he replied, giving her space to enter. You look amazing." She smiled, but her fingers played with the pendant at her neck. That gesture he'd learned meant she was processing emotions she didn't know how to express. Dinner was comfortable, filled with easy conversation and laughter. They talked about the day at the bakery, about a woodworking project Gabriel was finishing, about a book Gigi was reading. But beneath the normalcy of the conversation, there was an undercurrent, an awareness and anticipation that charged the air between them. When they finished eating, when the dishes were cleaned and the kitchen tidied, they moved to the living room. Gabriel lit the fireplace, not because they needed the warmth, but because the dancing light of the flames created an atmosphere that felt right. He put soft music on the record player, something jazz, instrumental, no words to distract. Gigi stood near the window, looking out at the street where the city lights were beginning to turn on one by one. Gabriel approached from behind, not touching her yet, but close enough that she knew he was there. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She turned to face him, and in the firelight he could see conflict on her face, desire mixed with fear, hope mixed with hesitation. "I'm thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I want to be with you. Completely. But I'm scared." Gabriel's heart squeezed. "Of what?" he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Of disappointing you," she admitted, and tears glistened in her eyes. I haven't been touched gently in a long time, Gabriel, and I don't know if I'll know how to be, if I'll be able to relax, if I'll be able to..." Gabriel placed a finger gently over her lips, silencing her. "Look at me," he said, waiting until her eyes met his. "You couldn't disappoint me. It's not possible, and we don't have to do anything you're not ready to do, not tonight, not ever. I'm here and I'll stay here no matter what happens or doesn't happen. But I want to," Gigi said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to be with you. I need to go slow. I need you to show me how it can be different." "Slow," Gabriel agreed, his hands rising to hold her face with the same tenderness he always used with her. "Everything at your pace. And if at any moment you want to stop, we stop. No questions, no judgment, okay?" "Okay," she whispered. Gabriel kissed her then, soft and slow, pouring all his love and patience into that kiss. His hands remained on her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, keeping the connection between them gentle but steady. Gigi melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the muscles through the fabric of his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster, but she was smiling, a shy but real smile. "Come here," Gabriel said, taking her hand and leading her to the couch. They sat, and he pulled her into his lap, arranging them so she was leaning against his chest, head under his chin, legs intertwined. "Let's just stay like this for a while. No rush." And they did. Minutes passed in comfortable silence, only the sounds of the crackling fire and the soft music in the background. Gabriel's hands caressed her arms, her back, repetitive and comforting movements that demanded nothing, that only offered warmth and presence. Slowly, Gabriel felt the tension leave Gigi's body. Her muscles relaxed, her breathing deepened, and she melted even further against him. And when she finally lifted her head to look at him, when her eyes met his in the dancing firelight, he saw that the fear had diminished, replaced by something warmer, more confident. "Gabriel," she said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'm ready. I want to be with you." "Are you sure?" he asked, needing to hear it, needing to know it was her choice. "Absolutely," she replied. Gabriel kissed her again, this time with more depth, more passion, but still with that inherent gentleness that defined everything between them. His hands began to explore, tracing the curve of her back, the line of her waist, the contour of her hips, but always over her clothes, always with implicit permission in each touch. Gigi responded with her own exploration, her hands sliding under his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin, the muscles of his back contracting under her touch. She felt him shiver, heard the low sound he made in the back of his throat, and felt a power in that, the power to affect someone this way, to be desired without being objectified. "Bedroom?" Gabriel murmured against her lips. "Please," she replied. He lifted her, literally picked her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing, and she laughed, surprised and delighted, wrapping her arms around his neck. He climbed the stairs with her like that, never stumbling, never hesitating, and when they reached his bedroom, he placed her gently in the center of the large bed. The bedroom was simply furnished. The bed, a wardrobe, a dresser, a lamp casting soft yellow light. Through the open window, a night breeze brought the smell of pine trees and the distant sound of crickets. Gabriel lay beside her, propped on one elbow, just looking at her for a long moment. "You're so beautiful," he said, and the reverence in his voice made tears well in her eyes again. "Not just on the outside, inside. Your strength, your courage, your heart. Everything about you is beautiful." "Show me," Gigi whispered. "Show me how it can be when there's love." And Gabriel showed her. With hands that trembled slightly but never wavered. With kisses that explored every inch of exposed skin. With words murmured in her ear that called her beautiful, precious, perfect. They removed each other's clothes slowly, piece by piece, with frequent pauses for kisses and caresses, for murmured confirmations and shy smiles. When they were finally without anything between them, when skin touched skin without barriers, Gabriel saw the moment of vulnerability pass across Gigi's face. Years of conditioning telling her that her body was something to be criticized and controlled. "Look at me," he said, waiting until she did. "You're perfect. Every inch of you is exactly as it should be." He kissed her then, kissed the insecurity away, and his hands explored her body with an appreciation that was part reverence and part desire. He learned what made her sigh, what made her arch, what made her say his name in a tone that was almost a plea. And when they finally joined, when they became one in the most intimate sense, it was slow and careful and filled with so much feeling that Gigi cried, not from pain, but from relief, from joy, from finally understanding that intimacy could be something beautiful instead of something to fear. Gabriel moved with her, not just physically but emotionally, reading every signal from her body, adjusting, checking, making sure every moment was about shared pleasure and not one-sided possession. He kissed her tears, murmured words of comfort and desire against her skin, held her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever touched, and when they reached climax, first her, then him, waves of pleasure washing over both. It was with eyes open, looking at each other, seeing and being seen completely. Afterward they lay intertwined, Gigi's head resting on his chest, her finger tracing meaningless patterns on his skin. Gabriel had one arm around her, holding her close, his other hand in her hair, gently massaging her scalp. "You made me feel again," Gigi said in the stillness that followed, her voice full of wonder. "I forgot it was possible to feel like this, safe, wanted, Loved. Gabriel kissed the top of her head. No, he said softly. You always knew. I just reminded you. She lifted her head to look at him, and what he saw in her eyes took his breath away. Love, pure and unguarded, shining like a flame that could never be extinguished. I love you, she said, the words coming easy, natural, inevitable. I know it might be too soon, but I love you, Gabriel. Completely. I love you too, he replied without hesitation. Since that day at the dock. Since that morning in my living room. Maybe even before in some different life where we were always meant to find each other. They kissed again, slow and sweet, and when they finally fell asleep, she safe in his arms, he with his nose buried in her hair, they both knew they'd crossed into territory they'd never return from, and neither of them wanted to go back. The months that followed were the happiest of Gigi's life. She and Gabriel weren't just lovers, they were partners, best friends, souls who had finally found their home in each other. She spent most nights at his house, or he at her apartment, and they'd started talking about finding a place together, about building a life that was truly theirs. The bakery was thriving. Mrs. Chen, noticing Gigi's natural talent and tireless work ethic, had started giving her more responsibilities. Gigi now created her own recipes, decorated wedding cakes, even helped with the bookkeeping. And on the bakery walls, hung with pride, were some of her watercolors, for sale to anyone who wanted to take a piece of art home. Gigi had sold 3 paintings that month. 3. People were paying money for her work, validating something she'd almost lost hope of ever being, a real artist. She was happy, truly, deeply happy, in a way she didn't remember being possible. Which was exactly why the universe chose that moment to remind her that the past is never as far away as we'd like to believe. It was an ordinary Tuesday mid-afternoon, when the bakery traffic was slow. Gigi was behind the counter, cleaning the espresso machine, humming softly to a song Gabriel had played that morning. Mrs. Chen was in the back, preparing dough for the next day. Only 2 customers were in the place, an elderly couple sharing a piece of lemon pie near the window. The bell above the door chimed. Gigi looked up with her usual welcoming smile, the words, "How can I help?" already forming on her lips. Then she saw who had entered, and the world stopped. Marcus. He stood in the bakery entrance, occupying the space in a way that made everything seem smaller, darker. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still with that rigid posture she'd once mistaken for confidence, but now recognized as the stiffness of someone always on the verge of exploding. His hair was cut shorter, and there were deeper lines around his eyes, but it was unmistakably him. His eyes found hers across the bakery space, and Gigi saw recognition, then something that looked like triumph pass across his face. "Gigi," he said, and just hearing her name in that voice, the voice that had whispered so much poison over the years, made her stomach turn. "I finally found you." Every muscle in Gigi's body froze. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it pulsing in her ears. Her hands, which had been holding the cleaning cloth, began to shake uncontrollably. No, not here. Not now. Not when she'd finally built something good. "Leave," she managed to say, her voice barely working. "You can't be here." Marcus took a step inside, letting the door slam behind him. The elderly couple stopped eating, sensing the tension in the air, their eyes moving between Gigi and the newcomer with growing concern. "Don't be dramatic," Marcus said, and that tone and that condescending tone that had always preceded violence made bile rise in Gigi's throat. "I just came to get what's mine. You. You're my wife, and you're coming home with me." "No." The word came out stronger this time, fueled by months of healing, by nights in Gabriel's arms learning she was worth more than this. "I'm not yours. I'll never be yours again." Marcus's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You think you can just run away? Think you can embarrass me, make me look like a fool to everyone we know?" His voice was rising, getting louder, more threatening. "You owe me, Gigi. I gave you everything. You gave me nothing but pain," Gigi interrupted him, and there was a strength in her voice now that she didn't know she possessed. "You hurt me, controlled me, made me feel less than human. But I'm not that woman anymore. I'm not afraid of you." It was a lie. She was terrified. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to lean against the counter to stay standing, but she wasn't going to let him see that. Wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Marcus started moving toward the counter, and true panic flooded through Gigi. Her eyes flew to the back door where Mrs. Chen was, wanting to scream for help, but afraid to provoke more anger from him. It was at that moment that the bell chimed again. Gabriel walked in, and Gigi had never been so relieved to see someone in her entire life. He must have come for his usual afternoon visit, suspecting nothing wrong, but the moment he stepped through the door, the moment he saw the scene before him, Gigi pale and trembling, an unknown man advancing toward her with obvious hostility, his entire posture changed. "Gigi," he said, his voice calm, but loaded with a protective intensity she'd never heard before. He crossed the bakery in 3 long strides, positioning himself between her and Marcus. "Is everything okay?" "Gabriel," she managed to say, and relief flooded her voice. Marcus looked at Gabriel, assessing, and something like disdain passed across his face. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Someone who actually cares about her," Gabriel replied, and though his tone was calm, there was steel beneath the words. "And you are?" "I'm her husband," Marcus said, as if that explained everything, as if that gave him some right. "And this is none of your business. Get out of the way." "No," Gabriel said simply, firmly, and didn't move an inch. "She told you to leave. So you're going to leave. Now." For a moment, the tension in the bakery was so thick it was almost tangible. The elderly couple had stood up, the woman with her cell phone in hand, clearly ready to call the police. Mrs. Chen had come out from the back, holding a wooden spoon like an improvised weapon, her face showing fierce determination. Marcus looked around, seeing he was outnumbered, seeing there was no one on his side. But men like Marcus didn't give up easily. Years of control didn't dissipate without a fight. "Gigi," he said, ignoring Gabriel completely, trying to look around him to see her. "You know you belong with me. You know you won't survive on your own. Without me, you're nothing." It was that comment, that final attempt to break her spirit, that finally broke the rest of Gigi's fear. Anger, pure and clean, surged through her. She came out from behind the counter, moving to stand beside Gabriel, not behind him. She needed Marcus to see her face, needed him to hear her words without barriers. "You're wrong," she said, and her voice was steady, clear, without trembling. "I'm everything without you. I'm stronger, happier, more myself than I ever was when I was with you. You tried to destroy me, Marcus, but you failed. I survived. I'm thriving, and I will never, ever go back to you." "Gigi," Marcus began, his voice taking on that warning tone she knew so well, the one that always meant violence was coming. But before he could take another step, before he could make any move toward her, the bakery door opened again. 2 police officers entered, called, Gigi realized, by the elderly woman who still held her phone. "Everything okay here?" one of the officers asked, his eyes immediately assessing the situation, the body language that spoke volumes. "No," Gabriel said, before anyone else could respond. "This man is harassing this woman. She asked him to leave and he refused." The second officer approached Marcus. "Sir, I need you to come with me now." Marcus looked around, at the police, at Gabriel still positioned protectively beside Gigi, at Mrs. Chen with her wooden spoon, at the elderly couple serving as witnesses. He knew he was cornered. "This isn't over," he said to Gigi, but the words sounded hollow now, empty of any real power. "You're my wife." "No," Gigi interrupted him one last time. "I'm not. I'm filing divorce papers tomorrow morning, and if you come near me again, I'll get a restraining order. You have no power over me anymore. It's over, Marcus, truly over." The officers escorted Marcus out, their voices fading as they moved away from the bakery. Through the window, Gigi could see them putting him in the squad car, probably to take him to the station for questioning. She watched until the car disappeared around the corner, taking with it the last ghost of her past. Then finally her legs gave out. Gabriel caught her before she fell, wrapping his arms around her, holding her against his chest as she collapsed, not in tears of sadness, but in sobs of pure relief. It was over. Really, truly over. She'd looked her abuser in the eyes and said no. had stood up for herself, had survived. "You were so brave," Gabriel murmured into her hair, his hands rubbing comforting circles on her back. "So incredibly brave. I'm so proud of you, Mrs." Chen brought water, and the elderly couple stayed until they were sure Gigi was okay, offering to be witnesses if she needed them for any legal proceedings. Their kindness, the care of strangers, made Gigi cry even more. But they were good tears now. When the bakery finally grew quiet again, when only Gabriel and Gigi remained, he held her away from him just enough to look at her face. "How are you?" he asked. "Truly?" Gigi took a deep breath, making an honest assessment. She was still shaking. Her heart was still beating too fast. But beneath the residual fear there was something else, something that felt like freedom. I'm okay," she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "Scared, yes, but okay. Better than okay. I stood up for myself, Gabriel. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I said no to him." "You said no," Gabriel agreed, smiling through his own glistening eyes. "And you were magnificent doing it." They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other in the middle of the empty bakery, the smell of fresh bread still perfuming the air, the afternoon light painting everything in golden tones. "What happens now?" Gigi finally asked. Gabriel kissed her forehead, her temples, her cheeks, landing finally on her lips in a kiss that was sweet and tender and full of promises. "Now," he said, "you live. We live. Together. No shadows, no fear, no more looking back. Just forward, to everything that's still to come." And as Gigi pressed back into his arms, as she let the warmth and solidity of him calm the last waves of adrenaline, she knew he was right. The past had tried to claim her one last time, and she'd said no. Now, finally, she was truly free to say yes, to Gabriel, to love, to the life she'd deserved all along. 1 year. 365 days since that confrontation in the bakery. 365 days of healing, growth, and building something that was truly theirs. So much had changed. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago. Marcus had tried to contest initially, but when Gigi presented medical documentation of her injuries, when witnesses came forward to confirm the pattern of abuse, he'd given up. The last she heard, he'd moved to another state. She hoped he'd never hurt another person the way he'd hurt her. But that wasn't her problem anymore. She'd done what she could. She'd freed herself, and that would have to be enough. Gigi and Gabriel found a house together, a small but charming house on the outskirts of Maplewood, with large windows that let in abundant light, and a basement that Gabriel transformed into a woodworking workshop. There was also an extra room that became Gigi's art studio, with an easel near the window and shelves full of paints and canvases. They didn't get married. Not yet, at least. Gigi needed time to heal completely from the idea of marriage as a prison, to reimagine it as something that could be choice and partnership instead of possession. Gabriel understood completely. He would have waited a lifetime if she needed, though he'd been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for months, waiting for the right moment, if that moment ever came. The bakery had thrived under Gigi's partial management. Mrs. Chen, recognizing not just her talent but her dedication, had made her a minority partner in the business. Now half the recipes sold were Gigi's creations, and the paintings on the walls changed monthly as new works were sold and replaced by others. She was gaining a reputation, small but growing, both as a baker and as an artist, and today was a special day. Very special. It was the 1-year anniversary of the bakery under new management, officially now Chen and Gigi's bakery, and they were throwing a party to celebrate. The bakery was decorated with balloons in shades of blue and white, banners hanging from the ceiling, tables pushed together to create more space for people to circulate. There were trays of pastries, small layered cakes, finger foods that Gigi had spent days preparing. All of Maplewood's community seemed to be there. Neighbors, regular customers, even Mr. Hoffman from the jewelry store in the neighboring town. People laughed, talked, ate, filling the space with that warm energy that comes from true community. And Gigi, standing in the middle of it all wearing a light blue dress, the same color as that shirt that changed everything, was radiant. Gabriel watched from across the room, leaning against the wall, just drinking in the sight of her. She'd changed so much from that broken woman he'd found at the dock. Not just physically, though she'd gained healthy weight and there was color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes, but it was more than that. There was a lightness to her now, a confidence that radiated outward. She laughed freely, touched people casually when talking, moved through the space with a grace that came from someone who finally felt safe in their own skin. She was beautiful, absolutely, undeniably beautiful. As if sensing his gaze, Gigi turned her head and her eyes found his across the sea of people. She smiled, that special smile that was just for him, and started making her way through the crowd toward him. "Hi," she said when she reached his side, sliding her arm around his waist and fitting against him like two puzzle pieces. "You're hiding over here in the corner." "I'm not hiding," Gabriel protested, kissing the top of her head, "just admiring the view." "The view of people overeating on cake," Gigi teased. "The view of you," he corrected, happy, glowing, "exactly where you should be." She leaned into him, her hand rising to touch the pendant that never left her neck. It was an unconscious gesture now, something she did whenever she felt emotional or grateful, or just full of love. "I never thanked you," she said suddenly, turning to look up at his face. "Not properly. For that day. For all the days since." "Gigi." "No," she interrupted gently. "Let me say this. You saved me, Gabriel. Not just physically that day at the dock, but emotionally, spiritually. You showed me that love could be gentle, that I was worth more than I thought, that I could be whole again." Gabriel held her face between his hands, that gesture that had become so familiar between them. "You saved me too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was living, but not really living, just going through the motions, alone, convinced that was all I deserved. And then you showed up and suddenly everything had color again, purpose, meaning. You gave me back my life as much as I gave you yours." Tears glistened in Gigi's eyes, but they were happy tears. She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, right there in the middle of the party, not caring who saw. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude and love and commitment, of pasts overcome and futures being built together. When they broke apart, there was applause. Some people had noticed, and soon the whole bakery was clapping and whistling and laughing with the kind of genuine joy that comes from witnessing something real and beautiful. Gigi laughed, her cheeks flushed, but didn't pull away from Gabriel. Instead, she held his hand and pulled him to the center of the room. "Since you're all here," she announced, her voice projecting over the crowd, "I wanted to share something. Many of you know my story, know where I came from. And you've seen how much this community, this bakery, Gabriel, have helped me heal and grow." She squeezed Gabriel's hand, drawing strength from him. "I came to Maplewood broken, ready to give up. And you," she looked around the room, making eye contact with face after face, "you showed me I was worth saving, that I deserved kindness, opportunity, love. You gave me a home when I had none, gave me hope when I'd lost it all." Her voice broke a little, but she continued, "So thank you, all of you, for welcoming me, for accepting me, for helping me become who I was supposed to be all along." There was more applause, some tissues being discreetly pulled from pockets and purses to dab at moist eyes. Mrs. Chen was openly crying, proud and moved. Gabriel pulled Gigi back against him, and they stood like that as the party continued around them. Eventually, the crowd dispersed back into their own groups. Conversations resumed. Music played again. "Come on," Gigi said suddenly, taking Gabriel's hand. "I want to show you something." She led him out of the bakery, down the street, walking quickly as if with purpose. Gabriel followed without question, curious about where they were going. The answer became clear when they reached the river, the old wooden dock. It was the same place where it all began. The boards still creaked the same way, the water still slapped against the pillars below. But it was different now. Not a place of despair, but a place of beginnings, of transformation. Gigi walked to the edge of the dock, stopping exactly where Gabriel had found her that rainy day. She looked at the water, then back at him, and there was something in her face, a determination mixed with vulnerability that he couldn't quite decipher. "You remember this place?" she asked. though it was obviously a rhetorical question. "Every day," Gabriel replied, moving closer to stand beside her. "I was sitting right here," Gigi said, pointing to the dock floor. "Soaked, hurt, so lost I couldn't see a way forward. And then you showed up, like a miracle, like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making." She turned to face him completely. "You put your jacket over my shoulders and took me home. You cared for me when I was a stranger. You saw me, really saw me, when I was at my worst, and didn't turn away." "Gigi," Gabriel began, but she shook her head. "Let me finish," she said. "I need to say this here, in this place where it all began." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Gabriel took them, holding them steady and warm between his. "You showed me what love should be," Gigi continued. "Patient, kind, respectful. You never pushed me, never rushed me, never made me feel like I owed you anything. You just stayed, consistently, unwavering, just present, and loving me through everything." Tears ran down her face now, but she was smiling. "I came to this dock ready to give up on living, and you gave me reasons to live again. You gave me love, yes, but also hope, purpose, a future. You gave me back myself." Gabriel had his own eyes moist now, his heart so full it ached. "So here, in this place where you saved me, where it all began," Gigi squeezed his hands, "I want to say thank you. I love you, Gabriel. More than words can say. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me." Gabriel pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight it was almost too much, but neither of them cared. They stood like that on the dock, cradled by the sound of water and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Two hearts that had found their way to each other against all odds. "Maybe," Gabriel murmured into her hair, "maybe we all need someone who sees us as if we're still whole, even when we think we're broken beyond repair." Gigi pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "You saw me whole," she said, "when I'd forgotten how to see myself that way. And for that, for you, I am eternally grateful." They kissed there, in the place where it all began, where one life had almost ended and another had begun. And when they finally walked back to town, hands intertwined, the sun setting in shades of orange and pink behind them, they both knew one simple but profound truth. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a whole love. True, built on foundations of choice and respect and mutual healing, made of shared silence, honest desire, and a yes said with the whole body, the whole soul. And that, they discovered, was much better than perfect. It was real. Gigi and Gabriel's story reminds us that sometimes salvation arrives in the most unlikely form, in a storm, in a stranger with a coat, in a moment when everything seems lost. It teaches us that true love isn't about possession or control, but about seeing someone in their entirety and choosing to stay, about offering kindness when the world has been cruel, about believing in the potential for healing even when the wounds seem too deep. Gigi found more than refuge that day at the dock. She found the courage to start over, the power to say no to what hurt her, and the strength to say yes to what made her flourish. Gabriel discovered that saving someone can also save us, that opening our heart to another person can fill voids we didn't even know existed. They proved that love can heal, that the past doesn't define the future, and that sometimes all we need is someone who sees us as if we're still whole, even when we think we're broken forever. And in the end, it wasn't about the perfect fairy tale ending. It was about two imperfect human beings building something real, honest, and deeply beautiful, a love that was born from darkness but bloomed in the light. Because sometimes all someone needs is to be seen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the Super Thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. Comment below where you're listening from. We'd love to know where our story reached.